want to start the day in a different way and remind people why we're here. I don't have a cool safety moment today. We're just going to go with yesterday's. Check your brakes. Okay, so what I wanted to start with is to remind people who is hosting this conference. It's the International Regulators Forum. So just wanted to let people know, if this is your first IRF conference, a little bit about the IRF. Okay, so I don't have the mission memorized. Sorry, I don't even have all of my family's birthdays memorized. So there's that. You can look it up. I feel like it's okay. So essentially, the International Regulators Forum is a forum of offshore petroleum, health, and safety regulators whose members are dedicated to the common cause of raising offshore health and safety standards. That's why we're all here, okay? We're here to exchange a good dialogue, best practices, learn something, all right? So I'd like to take a moment and tell you a little bit about their goals, okay? What we do after the conference, so we generally have a conference every 2 years, or as somebody steps up to take the helm and actually host it, because it is a lot of work. So hopefully we'll see another conference in a couple of years. Any volunteers on who wants to host that? You can get back to me. But the objectives are, we want to promote best sustainable safety performance globally. I think that's a great goal. We want to enable an exchange of information among regulators, I'd say also with the regulated community. And we want to provide a network of offshore petroleum health and safety regulators for basically supporting and advising as required, okay? I think we accomplished that yesterday, don't you? I think we had a good time and we were all able to exchange ideas. So let's continue that today. So I'd like to go through, and as I call your agency, could you stand up? These are the members of the IRF. Bessie, Ryan's right here. It's easy because that one was at the top. The PSA Norway, Ann Mirvold, thank you. We have ANP Brazil, they're still here. Hello, welcome. ASEA, I think there's a few people. I know Carlos just came in. Hi, Carlos. Hey there. All right. We have WorkSafe New Zealand. No, one not here. I think they're coming later this week. NOPSEMA, Australia. Hi there. Of course, you were here talking yesterday. State Supervision of Mines, the Netherlands. Hey there. Okay. We have the Danish Working Environmental Authority from Denmark. Good morning. And we have Health and Safety Executive from the UK. No, I saw you guys yesterday. Hey. Excellent. And then we have 3 Canadian regulators. The Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board. I thought I saw everybody yesterday. Hello. Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board. Good morning. And the NEB. And he's at my table, so I've seen him as well this morning. So these are all of the members. I would like to point out, strategically, we did something. We put a regulator or 3 at every table. That was some of the, that was some of the feedback that was received from the previous conference, that people would like to interact more and hear more from the regulators. So as you'll see, you have at least 1 regulator at your table, and if you didn't, that's because we ran out of regulators. Nah, we had plenty of regulators here. All right, plenty of those guys. So let me just really quick do a recap of yesterday. So we started out with the social license to operate, and we spent the bulk of the morning on that. I hope that we'll still see some of those themes throughout the day today. I thought that Ian did a great job, as well as the panel that followed. We talked about data at the end of the day, and we had a lot of requests for Ann's video, because that was awesome. Who thought that was a great video? I thought it was great. So as such, you don't have to ask Ann where it's going to be anymore, okay? We're going to post it on the IRF website after the event's over so that people can go and look at that. I will continue to watch it, be scared, because I don't want to be on that boulder. As it turns out, I realized when I watched the video that I do have a fear of heights and didn't realize it. So we also had, so we may put some other presentations up on that website too, but we'll see. We're going to get the permission from the people who have the slide deck. So stay tuned. Just keep looking at the IRF website. So today, how are we doing on time? Good. Today we're going to actually switch gears a little bit. We'll talk more about safety culture, which we started to get into a little bit yesterday. And a lot of people were getting very interested into participate in that dialogue. So I expect that today may be even more lively And I hope people really engage. If you feel a little reluctant to actually get on the mic and ask a question, I hope that you'll use one of the note cards. And if you put the note card in the area, one of the folks in the white shirts will come through and collect that, so that you don't have to ask it. What they'll do is they'll bring it to the stage, and then we can ask it from there. We just want everybody to feel comfortable, because not everybody likes to grab the mic, and I understand that. I don't always like to grab the mic, even though it seems like I do. So in the interest of keeping things moving, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what I'm going to tell you for the rest of the day, because I think you know it. You have the agenda in front of you. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on introducing the first moderator. So this session 4, as you can see, is identifying human risk factors, technological risk factors, and the nexus between the two. We felt this was so important that we essentially have 2 sessions on this theme, okay? We had a lot of experts, and as we were going through to invite people to speak, there were so many good people, we thought we should just have 2 panels. Very exciting. So you're gonna get a lot of that this morning. And the kinds of things we're thinking about, first question is, how do you distinguish and address the differences between technological risk and human factor issues? I hope we talk about that quite a bit, because as we've seen, as each one of us has looked at different analog data from other industries as well as our own, that interface between people and technology is oftentimes where things break down. Can they be approached as one and the same? I'm sure we all have our opinions about whether they're the same or not. How do you ensure appropriate competencies for specific operating environments? And then the last framing question is, how are safety alert systems being improved? We've actually run into this a little bit on our OCS in terms of safety alert systems in that regard, actually out in the field. It's important that people can actually hear them. We've talked about that internally. When the rubber meets the road and there's an incident, everybody needs to know if an alert system's going off and whether or not that check engine light's legit, okay? How many of us actually see the little tire light come on and say, I'll put air in my tires later, or they say, it's a faulty sensor, who's done it? Okay, a few people own it. I had one that the sensor actually was faulty. It was just too expensive to replace it in that really old car that you saw a picture of. And at some point later, when that part actually did break, I didn't have that warning light. So suffice to say, that car has now been retired. It's a pretty old car. And I always check those lights and make sure that they work. So I'd like to get some of the panelists moving on up here as I introduce Dr. John Harrald. He's a professor emeritus with George Washington University. He's an engineer. He's got a long career of working in this area of crisis management. He was the founding executive editor of the Journal of Homeland Security. He's past chair of the National Resource Council Disasters Roundtable. You can look at a lot. He's got a great background that he's going to bring to this panel. And I'd also like to say, one thing I learned in our conversation, he volunteers in a homeless shelter, which I think is great when people are giving back in their free time. It's not like you aren't busy, and it's great that you're able to do that. So I'm going to invite him, and please, all the other panelists, come up to the stage.
Should be on. As Allyson said, this panel is continuing on with the themes of social license and safety culture that were developed yesterday, and digging deeper, as the last panel yesterday did and the panels today will continue. We have a very distinguished panel of regulators here that will address these issues. Daniel Chicoyne, the Director of Safety and Chief Safety Officer of the Canada-Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board, and that's got to be one of the greatest acronyms of. Is there a short title for that? Carlos de Regules is the Executive Director of Agencia. Good morning. And Tony Hetherington, he was Head of Operations of the United Kingdom Health Safety Executive, which is here under stormy weather, and we appreciate his being here. It's been a tough time. Just because things start off with a little bit of an overview. One of the things I pick up from yesterday's discussion is, again, the recurring theme that we all who deal in risk understand is that just because something is low probability has not occurred, that does not mean it's impossible. We know that the perceptions that are out there, it has been written in many risk themes, that the public perception of risk is they interpret improbable as impossible, and then once the rare event occurs, it's seen as inevitable. And that's the bound that you as regulators face of convincing people that the improbable can happen, that it's worth devoting resources to mitigate, and then dealing with the aftermath of when it does occur. That's why they call them rare events. Just as a case in point, it was interesting, I just was part of a board 2 weeks ago of the National Academy of Sciences Marine Board, and the subject of the panel was an interesting assumption. It was the inverse assumption that we're talking here, was that the assumption of the panel was that the American flag fleet was so safe and had such a safety culture that the burden of safety regulations was an inappropriate cost for international competition. So the discussion was mainly on the cost of regulations, but the assumption that was back there was how safe and how good the safety culture of the fleet is. Does anybody recognize the picture that's there? Yes, that's 2 weeks later. The El Faro, an American flag ship en route to Puerto Rico, tried to outrace Hurricane Joaquin, lost the race, sunk with all hands for the worst disaster of the American flag fleet in 35 years. And the public agenda turned to, is the American flag fleet safe enough? Are we running old, decrepit flags? Is the inspection? And of course, focusing on the regulators of the Coast Guard and the American Bureau of Shipping and the Classification Society. I'm sure, tying with the human and technological factors, I'm sure that the investigations will show, to the extent that they can, because most of the evidence is in a very deep water at the moment, the interaction of technological failures that caused the engine to fail, technological or design failures that caused cargo problems or stability problems, and the ship eventually sank, the human errors that were involved dealing with these at the last minute. But step back a second, as we were talking yesterday, and look at the safety culture. What type of organizational safety culture do you have that you have a master of a vessel that thinks it's a good idea to race a hurricane between the hurricane eye of the hurricane and the lee shore of the Bahama Islands and leave himself no alternative other than to beat the hurricane? And given the technology and the AIS systems that exist, there's a home office that's watching the ship and knows exactly where it is. So what type of safety culture do you have at the office that thinks that's a good idea? Or at least an idea that you would leave that to the captain? These questions will be out, but I think that's an interesting example of the nexus between the safety culture we were talking about and the human error and technological error. Many times the safety culture are the lack of safety culture that lead to the opportunity to make these failures and errors. The technological advances, there's a dynamic that's going on. The technological advances allow us to create increasingly complex technological human systems, and they're capable of operating in extreme environments, certainly in the offshore environment. Understanding and managing risk in these complex systems requires us to understand and to anticipate technological failures, human errors, and the dysfunctional technological human interactions that can exist. Yesterday's discussion of social license stressed that the public expects that potential hazards will be identified, first of all, and the systems will be designed and mitigated with an acceptable risk and monitored to ensure safety. 3 steps: identifying the hazard. I put this slide up. if we want to talk about many of these, my background's largely maritime risk, and the analysis we do, we're dealing with the numbers we were talking about yesterday, 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4. When you get to 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, these are the probabilities that people are interpreting as, well, it can't happen. Well, I'll try to explain this to my daughter, who's an environmental biologist in Alaska and an environmental activist. Here's 4 instances that have happened in 41 years, all of which individually presumably have a probability of less than 1 in 1,000. And you have 4 in 40 years. What's wrong with this picture? And when you go to that environment, as I just did as a consultant to the Cook Inlet risk analysis on both the drilling and the expansion and the gas line, people are a little leery of forecasts of minimal hazard because this is the reality. And from Exxon Valdez, the Princeton Dam, Celadang, Maru, and the Kuluk shell oil grounding off of Kodiak Island. Just as a counterpoint, I'll point out, this just goes with scale. When we think, certainly in the Coast Guard background, the Princeton Dam was a great moment of saving the entire passengers and crew from a sinking vessel, helicopter airlifts, transports to the tankers that were coming out of the Alaska pipeline. It was and we look at that as a success and an idea that we could repeat that. And we heard yesterday about the cruise lines. Worst case scenario, I would propose that the worst case scenario is not a vessel that grounds on the shore of a major industrialized country. The worst case is a far offshore or someplace where there is no ability to rescue. This was a total crew of 410, something like that, people. The ships that carry the same route now are on 4,000. There's less helicopters, there's less tankers. If the same incident happened with a modern cruise ship, you would lose thousands of people. That's part of the cheery message for the day. Unfortunately, as I said, these expectations are not always met, but the failure to anticipate events like Macondo and Exxon Valdez disasters is one aspect, but the other part the discussion we'll talk a little bit about today is that errors and technological failures that occur in these systems, in these complex, may not be detected or may not be contained or may be ignored, and the factors designed to mitigate risk can be unobserved over a point in time. I'll hit with the last slide. This is just the Exxon Valdez, which is old news, obviously, at this point, but it's a classic case of a point where a system was created and the regulators did their job and then walked away over a 20-year period. So the existence, one thing we cannot forget is safety is a dynamic thing too, and it changes over time. This was set up, and it's a property of a system, not an individual vessel. Part of this is we looked at this as Exxon's problem. It was the system's problem. This whole transport, the ocean leg of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, was set up with a lot of study in the 1970s by the Coast Guard, Department of Interior, State of Alaska, many people. And a system was set up that consisted of a vessel traffic system, a Coast Guard Marine Safety Office, pilotage that went to the sea buoy off of Cape Hinchinbrook, state regulations, state inspections, obligations by the creation of Alyeska, on and on and on and on. And if you look at the cost pressures, which we're feeling in the industry right now, and we're certainly feeling in the government and budget cuts, and you start making cuts, and you look at the cumulative effect, little things like the Coast Guard changed its radar system to a short-range radar system, changed the staffing of the vessel traffic system from a 2-person watch to a 1-person watch. The Alaska Pilots Association changed the drop-off point from being further out in the shipping lanes to further up. The state of Alaska changed their inspection regime. Alyeska changed their pollution response regime. By the end of this, the system that was in place in 1989, which all of us living in the lower 48, if we ever thought about it at all, thought was equivalent to what was in there in 1979, but it wasn't. So the job of, once you are creating a system, the job of ensuring that the system stays safe is a job that the regulators have that is not funded, it's not appreciated, and it's absolutely critical. So the challenge of this panel is to explore how regulators can foster this safety culture and consider the interaction of human factors and technological factors and the protocols, warnings, and alarms that recognize when the system is degraded. And repeating the framing questions that Allyson said and turn it over to the panel is, how do you distinguish and address the differences between a technological risk and a human factor issue? How do you ensure appropriate competencies for specific operating environments? And how are safety alert systems being improved? And how can regulators ensure that safety alerts are properly handled? Okay, and we'll go in the order. Daniel, if you'll lead.
Okay, good morning. We discussed this slightly before we came in this morning. And when you look at technology risks and human risks, you can't really separate those. You have to look at them as a system. Humans designed and developed and used the technology. So when the technology fails, it's usually because there was some human interaction along the way. So you can't look at those things completely separately. You have to look at the human in the mix. You have to look at the technology in the mix. You have to look at whether or not the human has had proper training on the technology, whether the technology suits the human's physical and cognitive abilities. So all those, when you put them together, you see where the interaction is between them, because the human has to interact with the technology. So I think you can't look at them individually. You have to look at them as a system.
Carlos.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I totally agree with Daniel, and when I was looking into this subject, preparing to come here, I read a very interesting paper that was written in 1982. It's an essay on risk and culture, an essay on the selection of technical and environmental dangers. And a very powerful idea arose from that lecture. And it's that the fact that the perception of risk is not a direct consequence of the danger of a given physical situation. It is rather the product of shared values and beliefs around this physical situation. And when you start analyzing the accidents and what causes accidents, you quickly arrive to the conclusion that most accidents today are related to the human factor. Technology, systems, and process safety has pretty much already taken care of the large and more frequent accidents that used to happen probably in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Today, the residual accidents that exist have much to do with the human factor. So if that is the case, then a specific approach needs to be taken to address human factor as the main cause of accidents. And when you talk about human factor, all you're talking about is behavior. What drives behavior? What drives a safe behavior at work or an unsafe behavior at work? And this is really, when you come to think about it, is when the perception, the consciousness of being in front of a risk is the key factor. It's not the same attention that we put to driving, where we are driving on a regular road, than when we know we are riding and driving on ice. All our senses, all of our attention is really there when we know we are in front of a risk. So this risk consciousness, where does it come from? how do you produce it? This risk consciousness is the result of actually the real organizational culture in which the work is performed. In a company that puts forward the long term versus the short term, that puts forward clients and client satisfaction across time rather than tomorrow's deal. That organizational culture will probably drive a behavior at the workplace that is safer than in a company that is just looking for the next day big deal and profit. So if that's the case, if safe behavior is a function of risk consciousness, and risk consciousness is a function of organizational culture, then what do you do as a regulator to enhance this safe culture that derives from the real organizational culture? And my point here is that probably the most concrete expression of the organizational culture happens at the local level, at the shop, at the floor, and it's in the person of the local leader. So as regulators, I think we have a very interesting task ahead in trying to incentivize this leadership at the local level. How do we empower local leaders to be actually the champions of the safety culture at the shop, at the floor? So that's pretty much where my reflections were going some days ago.
Thank you. Tony? Yes.
Right. I want to take a slightly broader look at that. I don't resile at all from the fact that human factors and things like alarm handling or control room design are absolutely essential, and they're absolutely in the middle of the human factors as a specialism. But I want to look at this in a wider context, and it's about how the individual relates to the business, not just to the technology of the business, because I think there's an interface which we're talking about, which is about people interfacing with technology. But actually, as you've said, the technology comes from people, and often attitudes and behaviors around technology are actually associated with who and how that technology was introduced. So actually, I think our big problem here is about how people interface with people. And we are looking at one, by taking our people and technology interface, we're looking at actually a much wider issue. I think what's key around this is about actually engaging with the workforce in a meaningful way. When I say engaging with them, I don't mean having an effective means of telling them what to do. I mean an effective means of having some dialogue with them about the way things are done around here, i.e. culture, and the way things ought to be done around here if we're to achieve safety, and about making sure that managers actually are prepared to hear the bad news, that when things aren't done around here the way they think they are, that actually there are people in that workforce who are prepared to say those things, and people within the management chain who are prepared to listen and to act. And I think that's absolutely essential when we're talking about the offshore industry. We're dealing with a major hazard industry. If things go wrong, it is a catastrophe. And if we don't manage that relationship between the business and its people, we are not just failing to manage the safety of the people, but we're actually failing to manage the productivity of the industry, its ability to maintain safe production. We are managing at the same time its reputation. We are managing the investment in the asset. We're managing shareholder value. So when I look at this, I do not look at this as a safety problem. I look at this as an industry-wide problem, that actually in an industry like ours, safety is a product of all of those other things being done well. And as safety regulators, we have a role in making sure these things are done well. But slightly to argue with you, I don't think it's for the regulator to manage the risk. The risk is to be managed by the operator, and the operator, one of the ways of controlling risk is around its interface with its workforce. Now, again, we talked about leadership, and I actually absolutely with you around senior managers say one thing. First of all, senior managers have to say something which is consistent and credible right down the line. And I'm absolutely with you around local leadership being absolutely essential. I think when we talk about local leadership, we again, back into human factors, is what is that leadership that is powerful locally actually leading people towards?
Absolutely.
And it isn't necessarily what the top of the shop thinks it is. And the other thing I think local leadership we need to think about is who is the leader ultimately that those people will follow. We deal with a multi-contractual industry here. Is if I'm a pipe fitter, do I think that my relationship is with the local contractor that I work for? Is it with the head contractor, or is it actually with the owner, the operator, or the licensee? There's a whole range of relationships there and a whole pattern of different leaderships about who we identify with and who that leader is and what that relationship will be. So the more I talk, the more I realise I'm actually saying this is an impossible problem. I don't believe it is impossible, but I think if we ignore it at our expense, and it all comes down back to leadership. It comes back to leadership at every stage in the process, from design through to production and decommissioning. And one of the interfaces that I would like you to think about, which is also around technology, is actually the interface between what happens onshore and what happens offshore. There's inevitably a technological interface because the majority of it happens either over the radio, over a computer link, or that marvellous technology, a vessel which carries the material from one to the other. And there is often a huge disconnect between the way the priorities that are espoused onshore and how life is actually lived offshore. And when we're looking at an interface and a nexus, I think we ignore that interface at our peril as well. I think coming to sort of summarise, I think the workforce involvement is absolutely essential because we're actually asking for workers at every level in the organisation. And as I look around this room, I am sure that there is no one who is anything other than a worker here. I don't consider the workers in the offshore industry to be people with spanners who get muddy. I'm talking about workers, everybody who is employed across all the contractual relationships, and we need to have an interface and to engage them. But what we have to do is to engage them effectively. We have to engage them in the technology. We have to engage them in relationships. And I think the good news about this is actually if they are engaged and we engage them in why we are introducing change, why change is necessary, why change happens, then actually introducing new technology will be much easier if we can get the relationship and the engagement of the workforce right. Then that will be the most effective way we have of future-proofing the industry. But again, as I said, it is a huge challenge for us. I think those are the key points for me. I'll wait for somebody to come back and I'll stop there.